In this Secrets of Strixhaven draft guide, I'll be providing you with all of the information you need to know before diving into the format. I will be covering the set mechanics, I will provide archetype overviews, I'll go through the top commons for each color, I will talk about the combat tricks to be aware of, traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Kicking things off with the set mechanics, they are Prepare, Converge, and Mystical Archive. There are a couple more that we'll get to when we get to the specific archetypes because they are kind of tied to those archetypes. Prepare is a mechanic found on creatures, and each creature with the prepared mechanic can be prepared or unprepared. And if the creature is prepared, then they can cast their prepared spell. So in the case of Cheerful Osteomancer, when it enters prepared, and then you can cast Raise Dead for as long as Osteomancer is prepared, and once you've cast the Raise Dead, the Osteomancer becomes unprepared and you will no longer have access to that spell. So it's a pretty straightforward mechanic. Some cards can re-prepare themselves. Other cards, you kind of just get them, they come in prepared, and then they unprepare once you cast the spell, so you only kind of get to use it once, unless you play a different spell that then re-prepares them. So pretty straightforward mechanic. Next up is Converge, which cares about how many colors of mana you are spending to cast your spells. So in the case of Rancorous Archaic, it says this creature enters with a +1/+1 counter on it for each color of mana spent to cast it. So another pretty straightforward mechanic. Then there's also Mystical Archive, which is a mechanic that's kind of tied to the booster packs themselves. Each pack will have a single Mystical Archive card. They have this fancy art, and they're not from the main set, but you can still draft them and play them in your decks. So if you like the look of it, you can definitely draft it. You can definitely play it. So don't be scared by the fact that their art is a little bit different or a little more fancy. You can definitely still include these in your draft decks. Moving on to the archetypes. Because there's only 5 archetypes in this set, it makes more sense to talk about the archetypes first, because the rest of the cards will then be interpreted in the context of which archetypes they fit into. First up is White-Black, which is the Silver Quill deck. It cares about the Repartee mechanic. So a card like Scolding Administrator as a 2-mana 2/2 with Menace has Repartee. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell that targets a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So Repartee, just a shorthand for whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell that targets a creature, do a certain thing. In this case, it's put a +1/+1 counter onto the Scolding Administrator. And then when this creature dies, if it had counters on it, put those counters on up to 1 target creature. So a growing 2-drop that then puts its counters onto something else to make a different creature into a threat is absolutely fantastic and just the sort of card that you want to be starting your curve off with when you are playing these aggressive decks. And so Scolding Administrator can be really good. You can trigger Repartee by targeting things with like removal spells. That can be a really good way to get Repartee going. But then there's also a bunch of spells that are like maybe temporary things, like tap your opponent's creature, or if you want, or tap target creature, or something like of the nature of like give your creature a potential buff. So those are all ways to trigger Repartee. Scolding Administrator, really good early payoff. Graduation Day, also a really good 1-drop for this deck. You get this down on turn 1. It has Repartee. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. And so if you have Graduation Day in play, and you get down on turn 1, then any of the other synergy pieces you're playing are amplified by getting an extra +1/+1 counter to spread around. Now, it's not the greatest top deck in the late game when maybe you've already used all of your synergy pieces, but hopefully by that point in the game, you've already put a lot of pressure on your opponent and you're able to end the game before the fact that Graduation Day wouldn't be the best draw kind of comes up. And so that's just a really nice card to have access to for these aggressive curve-out strategies. And then Lecturing Scorn Mage is another really good early drop. It's a 1-mana 1/1 with Repartee. Put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So start the curve early, get that Lecturing Scorn Mage down, go that into an maybe Scolding Administrator, then kill your opponent's creature with a removal spell, put 2 +1/+1 counters on your creatures. You are in really good shape. Now, enabling these Repartee cards can also be pretty important. A card like Abigail, Poet Laureate, is absolutely fantastic in this role. It's a 3-mana 2/3 flyer. Whenever you cast a creature spell, Abigail becomes prepared, and then its prepared spell is Heroic Stanza, which is 2 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So not the most efficient card, but if you're using it to also trigger your Repartee cards, then it can maybe like 2 mana, put 2 +1/+1 counters on creatures because you target a creature that gets a counter from Repartee, or you have another thing in play that puts counters, and that can be a really nice thing to have access to, especially on a consistent basis, because you play Abigail, then you play a creature, it becomes prepared, you play the stanza to get your Repartee stuff going, you play another creature, you play the stanza. It's going to be a really nice way to get consistent value and the ability to get a lot of Repartee triggers. Rapier Wit is a nice common for this deck. 2 mana, tap a creature, tap target creature, and so you can trigger Repartee that way. If it's on your turn, put a stun counter on it, so potentially remove a blocker for a couple of turns and draw a card. So you keep churning through your deck while also triggering your Repartee things. And the fact that it's an instant means that if you are attacking and you're in mid-combat, maybe you have some Repartee stuff that you want to trigger at instant speed, then you can do that as well, though then you won't really get the full benefit of tapping the creature. The flexibility can certainly be nice. And then Killian's Confidence is another nice payoff for this kind of deck as an enabler. It's 2 mana for a sorcery. Target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Draw a card. So sorcery speed means you can't really use it as a combat trick, but it draws you a card, so you're not going down a card. And whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you may pay 1 mana of white or black hybrid. I mean, if you do, return the card from your graveyard to your hand. And so that means you can potentially, if you're able to keep the pressure on and keep hitting your opponent, you can keep getting back Killian's Confidence, keep using it to trigger your repartee cards, and then keep drawing extra cards when you're casting your Killian's Confidence. So a nice little enabler as well. Next up is Blue-Red, which is the Prismari colors. This is a deck that cares about Opus, which is a mechanic that rewards you for casting instants and sorceries. Elemental Mascot is a great 3-drop for this deck. It's a 1/4 flyer for 3 mana with flying and vigilance, and then it has Opus. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, this creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. If 5 or more mana was spent to cast that spell, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card until the end of your next turn. So Opus, is, as a general mechanic, cares about casting instants and sorceries, and then gives you a bigger reward for casting one that you spent 5 or more mana on. So Elemental Mascot in this case gets a little bit of a buff. +1/+0 is definitely a relevant stats boost on a 1/4 creature, and then it gets you some card advantage if you are able to spend 5 or more mana to cast your instants or sorceries. So Elemental Mascot can be a really, really nice addition to your decks. If you're an aggressive deck, chipping in for a couple points of damage every turn with your flyer can be really nice, because like it can oftentimes attack for more than just the 1 point of damage because of that +1/+0. The fact that it has vigilance means even in a defensive deck, you're still chipping in while having a 4 toughness blocker that could potentially block as like a 2/4 if you cast an instant on your opponent's turn, and also can start getting you card advantage if you're casting these expensive spells in the late game. And so Elemental Mascot, really nice 3-drop for your blue-red decks. Next up, there's Muse Seeker, which is a 2 mana 1/2, not the greatest stats for an aggressive deck, but a really nice little early roadblock that can start fueling your synergies in your more defensive decks. And then it has Opus. If you cast the instant or sorcery, you draw a card, and then unless it costs 5 or more mana, you then discard a card. So you're looting in the early stages of the game when you're casting your cheap instants and sorceries, and then once you start casting your bigger ones, you're just straight up getting card advantage. So this is a really nice, good early play to make for your more defensive decks, where it's going to help you filter your draws, find your key spells, and then start casting bigger spells and drawing you more cards, which can just be extremely relevant. And then there is for a more aggressive blue-red deck, a card like Spectacular Skywhale, which is a 4 mana 1/4 with flying, and then has Opus. If you're casting a little spell, it gets +3/+0 until end of turn. And if you're casting the big spell, which is the 5 or more, I'm just going to shorthand that to being a big spell, then you get to put 3 +1/+1 counters on it instead. So if you play like Spectacular Skywhale on turn 4, and then on turn 5 you play a big spell, all of a sudden you're attacking your opponent with a 4/7 flyer that you only spent 4 mana on, and then maybe on the next turn you play 2 small spells and you're hitting your opponent for 10 damage. It can just deal so much damage in such a short period of time, because +3/+0 for a single instant or sorcery is really good. And one thing worth noting with the Opus cards is that because of the prepared mechanic, there's a lot more instants and sorceries running around than maybe there would be in a typical set, because your creatures will randomly have instants and sorceries associated with them some percentage of the time. And so instead of it being a deck where maybe you have like 13 creatures and then you have like 7 instants or something like that, it can be a deck where you have 13 creatures, but of those creatures, maybe 4 of them or have instants and sorceries associated with them or something of that nature. So that just boosts your synergy count for these Opus cards and can be a really nice thing to keep an eye out for when building these decks. There's also some really good enablers for this strategy. Abstract Paint Mage is a 3 mana 2/2. At the beginning of your first main phase, add 2 mana. Spend this mana only to cast instant and sorcery spells. So whether you're an aggressive deck that wants to be rushing out big spells to help pressure your opponent, or a more defensive deck that's trying to use this to help double spell to maybe defend yourself, use the 2 mana to cast a removal spell and also to play a creature for blocking purposes, this is a really nice enabler for this strategy. Sonar Unfinished Genius definitely fits more into the defensive camp for these blue-red decks as a 2 mana 0/4. It enters prepared and can tap to create a treasure only if you've cast an instant or sorcery this turn. So a 0/4 that can start making you treasure tokens to help you ramp out your bigger spells. And then its prepared spell is a big spell itself. 5 mana for search your library for an instant or sorcery card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. So you can use this to trigger your Opus cards, your big version of your Opus spells, your Opus triggers, and then also search for a key card in the moment, and potentially even really use that to trigger your Opus cards again for your big version if you get a big one, or just cast a cheap removal spell or something of that nature. And then Visionary's Dance is a really good card for this sort of strategy as well, because as a 7 mana sorcery, it'll trigger your big Opus cards. It creates 2 3/3 blue and red elemental creature tokens with flying, so it gives you a real nice late game play for your blue-red decks, but also has 2 mana, discard this card, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put 1 into your hand, the other into your graveyard. So it gives you a nice buyout clause in the early stages of the game when you don't have the 7 mana to cast this. You can still spend that 2 mana in a productive way, help you hit land drops, help you find more key synergy pieces, maybe dig for a removal spell if you really need one, and that's a really nice thing to have available, where you don't necessarily have to be casting the spell for the super expensive mana, you have a backup version. Now, black-green is the next deck, and this is the deck that cares about the Infusion deck. It's Witherbloom, and Infusion is a mechanic that rewards you for gaining life. So Old Growth Educator is a great example of this. It's 4 mana for a 4/4 with Vigilance and Reach. But when this creature enters, put 2+1/+1 counters on it if you gained life this turn. So the difference between a 4 mana 4/4 with Vigilance and Reach and a 4 mana 6/6 with Vigilance and Reach is a pretty big difference, especially if you are able to get this working as early as turn 4. How might you do that, you might ask? Well, a card like Bogwater Lumerette works really well in this sort of strategy. It's 2 mana for a 2/2. Whenever this creature or another creature you control enters, you gain 1 life. So just by playing your creatures, Bogwater Lumerette will be gaining you life, which will help you trigger your infusion cards, which means you don't have to spend like extra resources, extra mana to like set up combos. You don't have to be like, oh, I have a card that gains me life and a card that cares about gaining life. When you have the Bogwater Lumerette in play, you just gain life as you cast your creatures, which works really well with your synergy pieces. A nice payoff synergy piece at common is Pest Mascot. It's 3 mana for a 2/3 trampler. Whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So if you go Bogwater Lumerette into Pest Mascot, all of a sudden the Pest Mascot's immediately growing and becomes a 3/4 trampler, and then every creature you play continues to grow it. These sorts of synergy packages are just what you're looking to do in your black-green decks. And also keep in mind that gaining life helps you stabilize against more aggressive decks. So you're playing some good value cards to help you grind through the mid-game. And if you're playing against an aggressive deck, that can be really, really useful because the extra life can help you buy some extra time. Some other ways to gain life are these pest tokens that some cards generate. Essence Knit Scholar is a good example. 3 mana for a 3/1. When this creature enters, create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, whenever this token attacks, you gain 1 life. So sometimes the pest tokens are going to have to chump attack if you want to be gaining that life for a particular infusion payoff on a certain turn. But oftentimes you're going to be able to get these pest tokens in a fairly reasonable way, like Essence Knit Scholar, you're getting the 3/1 and the pest token. So if you do have to chump attack, it's not the end of the world, especially if you're triggering an infusion card that works super well. And if your opponent doesn't have any blockers for it, gaining that extra life can also be super relevant. And Essence Knit Scholar also kind of is a nice one to have if you have these pest tokens chump attacking, because at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died under your control this turn, draw a card. So if you do send in a pest token, your opponent blocks it and doesn't even lose a creature, you do draw a card on your end step. And so you can turn those pests not only into ways to work with your infusion cards, but also into a little bit of extra card flow. Send in the Pest is a nice common for this deck. 2 mana, sorcery, each opponent discards a card. You create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, whenever this token attacks, you gain 1 life. So if you are playing against a black-green deck, this is the sort of card you should expect. So if you have the sort of thing where you have enough lands in play already, and you have the choice between playing extra lands or just holding an extra land in hand to protect your key spells, keep Send in the Pest in mind, and maybe keep that extra land in your hand. But definitely a nice card to have available for this deck as a synergy piece. And then Luwin Exchange Student is a way that you can make a whole bunch of pests. It's 4 mana for a 3/4. It enters prepared. Its prepared spell is Pest Friend, which is 1 mana to make a 1/1 pest creature token. And then also you can exile a creature from your graveyard and to make Luwin prepared again. So you play Luwin, you can make a pest, and then you can start turning all of the extra creatures in your graveyard into fuel for more pests, which can be really scary in the mid game, especially if you've been trading off a bunch of creatures. Next up is Red-White, which is the Lorehold archetype. This is not your conventional red-white beatdown deck. This one cares about getting cards to leave your graveyard. So Spirit Mascot can be a really nice 2-drop for this deck. 2 mana 2/2. Whenever 1 or more cards leave your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So it can be a nice beatdown threat if you play this and start exiling cards from your graveyard as part of developing your game plan. But it can also be a nice growing threat for a more mid-rangey style deck. A card like Garrison Excavator can also be a really nice payoff for having cards leave your graveyard. 4 mana, 3/4 menace. When 1 or more cards leave your graveyard, you get a 2/2 red and white spirit creature token. So if you can do that consistently, you can just make an army with just 1 card, which is really scary. And then Primary Research is another really good payoff. 5 mana. When this enchantment enters, return target non-land permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So that can be a creature or something like that. And it's going to also say at the beginning of your end step, if a card left your graveyard this turn, draw a card. So it kind of works on both ends. It'll have a card leave your graveyard because you're returning a non-land permanent with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So it's going from the graveyard to the battlefield, leaving your graveyard, and you'll draw a card if something left your graveyard this turn. So getting a lot of value, especially if you can trigger these cards multiple times. How might you trigger these cards, you might ask? Well, here are some of these synergy pieces you're going to be looking for. Practice Scrollsmith, 3 mana, 3/2 first strike. When it enters, exile target non-creature, non-land card from your graveyard. Until the end of your next turn, you may cast that card. So this is a way to not only get some value with a 3 mana, 3/2 that you're going to get to recast in probably an instant or sorcery from your graveyard in most cases, but you're also exiling a card from your graveyard to get that extra synergy with those cards that care about having things leave your graveyard. Startled Relic Sloth is absolutely fantastic in this role because the 4-mana 4/4 trample lifelink, which is already great, and then at the beginning of combat on your turn, exile up to one target card from a graveyard. So you can just exile cards from your graveyard every single turn. You don't even have to spend extra mana on it, so you're triggering your synergies without having to use extra resources on that, which means you can just spend your turns deploying more synergy pieces that care about cards leaving your graveyard. This can also exile cards from your opponent's graveyard, so if they have like a flashback spell, which we'll talk about in one moment, or if they have a red-white deck of their own and they don't have their payoffs in play yet, then you can just start exiling cards from their graveyard to make it harder on them. And then speaking of flashback spells, we have a card like Group Project. 2-mana sorcery, make a 2/2 red and white spirit creature token. So 2 mana for a 2/2, that's a pretty okay rate. Not the best, but you expect a little bit of extra upside on your 2-mana 2/2s these days, but this one definitely has it. Flashback, tap 3 untapped creatures you control, so it means you can get another 2/2 while also triggering your cards that care about having things leave the graveyard, because when you flash it back, it leaves your graveyard. So Group Project can be a really nice little synergy piece and other flashback cards as well for this red-white deck. The final archetype is blue-green, which is Quandrix, and it has the increment mechanic. Fractal Tender is a great example. It's 5 mana for a 3/3 with Ward 2, and then increment. Whenever you cast a spell, if the amount of mana you spent is greater than this creature's power or toughness, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So if you play your Fractal Tender, and then you play a 4-mana spell, it gets a counter, and then the next turn, if you play a 5-mana spell, it gets a counter. And at the beginning of each end step, if you put a counter on this creature this turn, create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token and put 3 +1/+1 counters on it. So that's a really nice reward, not only because you're going to get a growing creature, but also because every time you do get that increment to work, you're going to be able to get an extra 3/3 with your Fractal Tender, which is really, really nice. Additive Evolution is another good card for this deck. It's 5 mana. You get a 0/0, but it gets 3 counters on it. So that's 5 mana for a 3/3 kind of. But at the beginning of combat on your turn, you put a counter on target creature you control. It gains Vigilance until end of turn. So at the very baseline, you play this on turn 5. In your first main phase, go to combat, put a counter on that 3/3. So all of a sudden, it's like 5 mana for a 4/4, but then the next turn you get another counter. So by the time it's attacking, it's like a 5/5 vigilance, and you can move the counters around, so you can put them onto your Fractal Tender every turn to get an extra 3/3 every turn if you have something like that enabled. But just a really nice little value play, because your blue-green decks are oftentimes going to want to go to the mid game, to the late game, and this sort of recurring advantage is really nice to have there. And then Tester of the Tangential is a bit of a value engine. You can get going a little earlier. 2 mana for a 1/1 with increment, so pretty easy to get your 1/1 to grow, because you just need to cast spells that have mana, that you spend more mana than its power or toughness. And so if you have a 1/1, you just spend 2 mana, then 3 mana, and then 4 mana. So it's pretty easy to get at least the first couple of counters on this. And then at the beginning of combat on your turn, you can spend X when you do move X counters from this creature onto another target creature. So you can then take the counters that you've built up on the tester, move them to another creature, and then once again, it's pretty easy to start getting those extra counters built up, because that's the thing about increment, is it gets harder and harder over time because you only have so many expensive spells. Now, speaking of a little bit of enablers for helping you cast more and more expensive spells, a card like Paradox Surveyor can be really nice to help you build up your mana. 3 mana for a 3/3 reach, good defensive resource. When it enters, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You can reveal a land card or a card with X in its mana cost from among them and put them into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this sort of card helps you continually hit your land drops, so you can keep casting more and more expensive spells to trigger your increment cards and also just go into the late game really well. And also X spells can be a really good part of that, because when you do have an X spell, that card can kind of fit anywhere in your curve to trigger increment exactly where you need it, or in the late game, just a really good top deck once you've built up all of this mana. Tam Observant Sequencer also helps you go to the mid game with a bunch of lands. So 4 mana for a 4/3, it has landfall. When a land enters, it becomes prepared. And then the prepared spell is 2 mana for a sorcery. You draw a card and gain 1 life. So you'll be able to hit your land drops more consistently, because when you play your land, Tam becomes prepared. You spend the 2 mana to draw a card and gain a life. That helps you draw through your deck to find more of your spells, but also you'll then find more lands. So you'll be able to build up lands a little bit more effectively than your opponents, because you're going to be able to draw more cards and then hit more land drops naturally. And then a card like Terrafractal is a nice little X spell at common for this deck. It's X blue-green for a 1/0 flyer, but it enters with X +1/+1 counters on it, and when it enters, you gain 2 life. So if you cast it in the middle stages of the game, maybe you'll get like a 4 mana for a 3/2 flyer or something, which isn't the best rate, but you are gaining some life. But maybe it's just what you need at that point in your curve to trigger your increment cards, and you really need that. But by the time you get to the late game, you can cast Terrafractal for huge amounts of mana, because you've been building up extra spells. Maybe your Paradox Surveyor finds your Terrafractal, because it can find your spells, cards that have X in their mana cost. And so Terrafractal can just be a nice little synergy piece for this sort of deck that wants to get into the mid stages of the game, wants to get its big creatures kind of online, but once you've kind of built up your mana base, and also have the optionality to cast it earlier in the game if you really need to. Moving on to the top commons now that we kind of understand the archetypes and where these commons might fit. Elite Interceptor coming in at number 1 for white. It's a 1 mana 1/2. It enters prepared. Its prepared spell is 2 mana. You may tap or untap target creature, draw a card. So the real great start for a Silver Quill black-white deck, because you get this card down early and then you kind of have the prepared spell available to just tap something down whenever you need to and also trigger your Repartee card. So just a really nice card to have available. And next up is a Johnny's Response. 5 mana for an instant to destroy target creature, but it costs 3 less to cast if it targets a tapped creature. And this will target a creature, so it will trigger your Repartee cards, but maybe fits a little bit better into a more defensive red-white deck, because if you are playing a defensive deck, then your opponent's creature is more likely to be tapped, and then a Johnny's Response can be cast for that discount. Though, of course, you can synergize this with a card like Elite Interceptor to tap your opponent's creature using one of your other cards, and then cast a Johnny's Response for the discount, which can certainly be relevant. It's also just a nice little kill spell to have access to. Just even if you're playing an aggressive deck, sometimes you're going to be on the draw, or you're going to have a little bit of a slow start and be on the back foot, and casting a cheap removal spell can be a good way to turn the tide, and the Johnny's Response can help you do that. Then at number 3 is Eager Glyph Mage, 4 mana for a 3/3, and when it enters, you create a 1/1 white and black Inkling creature token with flying. 4 mana for a 3/3 and a 1/1 is just a pretty generally good rate, because it gives you a lot of flexibility. If you ever trade off the 1/1 for one of your opponent's creatures, like let's say they have a 2/1, all of a sudden you kind of end up ahead because you've got that extra 3/3, or vice versa. If you trade off the 3/3 with one of your opponent's 3/3s, and then you're left with a 1/1 flyer, you kind of end up ahead on that exchange. There's a lot of flexibility you can do with how you determine like how you want to block. It gives you some double blocking flexibility, and overall is just a really nice card to have available. And the 1/1 flyer is really useful for like chipping in for damage, because a 1/1 on the ground at that stage of the game often isn't going to be able to do a lot of work in terms of contributing to the damage, but a 1/1 flyer can oftentimes just chip in if your opponent doesn't have a reach creature or a flyer of their own. Next up is blue. At number 1 is Essence Scatter, a really nice interactive spell for blue. It scales really well into the game. If you have to cast this early in the game to counter your opponent's like 3-drop, you're fine with that. But if you also can counter their 6-drop in the late game, that's an absolutely back-breaking play. And the fact that you can just do that for 2 mana is really, really nice. It does only target creatures, but there are plenty of other instant speed things you can do in this format. So if you have Essence Scatter and then you just have like another instant speed removal spell or something like that, if your opponent doesn't happen to cast a creature, you can often find another way to spend your mana. And because a lot of the creatures have these prepared spells associated with them, countering a creature can really stop your opponent from getting some pretty significant value in this set. Next up in blue is Run Behind. It's 4 mana for an instant. Its spell costs 1 less to cast if it targets an attacking creature, so you can oftentimes cast it for just 3 mana. Target creature's owner puts it on their choice of the top or bottom of their library. So casting a nice little removal spell in blue, this is a removal spell rather than just a bounce spell, because it puts the card back into their deck, so they will have to redraw it before they deploy it. So it is just kind of blue interaction. This is what blue gets. And casting this for 3 mana is a pretty efficient thing to do. Also, instant speed interaction spells in blue are nice, because if you do have any Opus cards, maybe if you're playing like a blue-red deck, then you play Run Behind on your opponent's turn, you can like maybe boost the stats of some of your Opus cards or something of that nature, and then your Opus cards are better on your opponent's turn. Or if you have an Opus card on your turn, you attack your opponent, they don't know whether its stats are going to get buffed or you're going to get your trigger from something. And so having instant speed interaction is especially good when you have Opus cards. An example of an Opus card is Deluge Virtuoso. It's 3 mana for a 2/2. When it enters, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. So that's pretty nice for an aggressive deck, because it'll lock down a potential blocker for 2 turns, because it can't block on the turn you play the Virtuoso, can't block the next turn because it still is just removed the stun counter. And then there's Opus. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. If you cast a big spell, it gets +2/+2 instead. So Deluge Virtuoso can definitely be a nice contributor to an aggressive strategy. Tap down your opponent's blockers and then just start boosting its stats when you cast your instants and sorceries. But it can also be a fine defensive like tool, stop your opponent from attacking for a turn by tapping one of their potential attackers. And then potentially if you're casting instants on their turn, it can be a reasonably sized blocker as well. So a nice little 3-drop for your blue decks. Next up is black. At number 1 is Last Gasp. 2 mana, -3/-3 at instant speed. Just what you're looking for in any black deck. It can help you remove blockers if you're trying to be aggressive. It can help you remove attackers if you're trying to be defensive. It'll work with your Repartee cards if you're playing a black-white deck that cares about that. And overall, it's just a really nice, efficient, cheap removal spell that you're going to be happy to have. Next up is Wander Off. 4 mana, instant, exile target creature. Very straightforward. It is a relatively inefficient at 4 mana compared to something like Last Gasp, but it can kill anything and it can exile anything, which is definitely a significant upside to have when you just need to be able to kill bigger creatures, and also can trigger your Repartee cards and things of that nature. It's just the sort of removal spell you're going to have to take, and instant speed does give you a lot of extra upside on these sorts of removal spells, with Last Gasp and Wander Off being instant speed is definitely a big upside, especially because if you are playing maybe like a Repartee deck, you want to be able to trigger your cards potentially without your opponent knowing what you're going to do. Maybe on their end step, you kill one of their creatures and a couple of your things get counters, and all of a sudden their blocks that they thought they would have are thrown off. Wander Off and Last Gasp are just really good for something like that. And then at number 3 is Sneering Shade Rider, 5 mana for a 3/3 flyer. When it enters, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So a really nice top end card for your black decks. In a black-white deck, it can really help you push the last point of damage across by giving you that drain for 2, but it can also be a fine tool in your black-green decks, gain you some life, work with some of your infusion cards, though generally you want your flyers to be in more aggressive decks because then you get the benefit of flying, where if you're blocking, a flyer is just a 3/3 on defense, but if you're attacking, then you really get the benefit of flying. So oftentimes a little bit better in an aggressive shell, or when it's attacking, but because it gains you 2 life and makes your opponent lose 2 life, it often puts you in a really favorable spot for racing situations, so it can be fine in more mid-rangey decks, or really just any deck that wants to have a nice little 5-drop flyer. It's good for your black decks. Next up is red. At number 1 is Unsubtle Mockery. 3 mana, instant speed, deal 4 to target creature, surveil 1. Pretty straightforward, but a really nice removal spell for red. Once again, being able to trigger your Opus cards at instant speed can be really nice. And also, if you are playing a deck that cares about like exiling cards from your own graveyard, casting this card and then surveilling something into your graveyard can get 2 cards into your graveyard, so you can keep triggering your synergies really nicely. And surveil 1 is also just nice because it gives you some card selection. If you don't need the lands, you can get rid of lands. If you do need the land, you can get rid of spells. Just nice flexibility there, but also being potentially able to put 2 cards into your graveyard, all attached to a great removal spell, can also be really nice for lower hold decks. Next up is Expressive Fire Dancer. 2 mana, 2/2, but it has Opus. If you cast a small spell, it gets +1/+1. If you spent 5 or more mana to cast the spell, it also gains double strike until end of turn. So if you have Expressive Fire Dancer, your opponent's in a real pickle if they're determining whether or not to block, because if you attack into their 3/3 or something, you just cast an instant, all of a sudden your 2-drop trades with their 3/3, maybe they spent 3 mana on that, you end up with a little bit of a favorable exchange. But once you get to the mid stages of the game where you have the option to cast a big spell, all of a sudden their 3/3 doesn't really want to ever block your Expressive Fire Dancer, because if you cast a big spell, it becomes a 3/3 double striker and then like eats their creature, which can be really scary, and threatens to like eat even bigger creatures, like, or trade with bigger creatures. Like if they have like a 5/5, Expressive Fire Dancer can trade with that, and that's just really, really scary. And if they don't trade with it, if they decide, oh, okay, I'll just take the 2 damage, if you have the ability to work with it anyway, you're dealing a bunch of extra damage, because turning your 2/2 into a 3/3 double strike is just really, really scary. And if you get to a spot where you can maybe chain multiple spells or something like that, Expressive Fire Dancer is just a really, really scary 2-drop. And then finally is Heated Argument. 5 mana, deal 6 at instant speed. You may exile a card from your graveyard. If you do, Heated Argument also deals 2 damage to that creature's controller. So 5 mana instant is the breakpoint for an Opus big spell, so that's really nice for that deck. Exiling a card from your graveyard can be really nice for a lore hold deck if you have some cards that care about the red-white deck that cares about having things leave your graveyard. And also dealing 2 extra damage to your opponent is definite upside if you're trying to play an aggressive deck, because every point of damage matters, especially if you're maybe playing against a black-green deck that's gaining a couple extra points of life over the course of the game. Being able to do a couple extra points of damage can really help offset that. This is just a really nice flexible top-end removal spell that synergizes with pretty much of the red decks you're going to be trying to play in the format, and also just is going to answer most of the creatures you care about. Like 6 damage is a lot of damage. Next up is green. At number 1 is Barrage Barrage. So 2 mana, target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn. If you've cast another instant or sorcery spell this turn, then it deals damage equal to its power to up to 1 target creature an opponent controls. Having this be at instant speed is really nice, because sometimes these spells can get blown out by your opponent having a removal spell in response, and the fact that you have this at instant speed makes that a lot easier to play around. Also, the fact that if you cast another instant or sorcery, you can get a temporary buff is really nice as well, because that can just help you push some extra damage. Maybe you can set it up so that you can kill a slightly bigger creature than you otherwise would have been able to do. And the fact that the prepared creatures often do come with instants and sorceries means it's a little bit easier to set that up as well. Green's going to need some interaction. This is the green interaction you're going to get, and it's going to be a pretty efficient spell for you and one you're pretty happy playing. It also plays really well with Noxious Newt, because Noxious Newt is a 2 mana 1/2 Death Touch. Death Touch works well because if the Death Toucher deals any damage, then it'll kill the creature, and it can tap for green mana. Death Touch is just a really good mechanic in terms of scaling your creature into the game. A 2 mana 1/2 might not be the most relevant body on turn 5 or 6, but the fact that it has Death Touch means that even your opponent's 6/6s are going to still trade with the Noxious Newt. And the fact that it trades with creatures in the late game while also adding mana for the early stages or even mid-game stages if you're casting big X spells in a blue-green deck means that Noxious Newt is going to be a really good card to play on turn 2, while not being a terrible draw to draw on like turn 5 or 6. So it's going to be a really nice card to have for your green decks. Then at number 3 is Tenured Concoctor. 5 mana for a 4/5 with a Vigilance. So pretty beefy stat line. It also has whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. So if your opponent is trying to just kill your big blocker, you get to draw a card at the very least, which is going to be pretty nice for you. And then it has Infusion. This creature gets +2/+0 as long as you gained life this turn. So it's going to attack for big chunks of damage if you're able to get that Infusion working. Attacking for 6 is a pretty meaningful upgrade over attacking for 4. But the fact that it has Vigilance means it can just chip in for a lot for damage every single turn, while also not being vulnerable to like the tempo plays that opponents will sometimes try to use on this sort of card. Because sometimes you'll try to play your top end creature and they'll like play a card that we've already seen that will like tap it. And if they tap it, you get to draw a card, which is just really good for you. And so unless they're like killing you that turn, but if you are being able to play your top end card and then your opponent does get punished for interacting with it, that tends to be a good place to be. And Tenured Concoctor is a card you're going to be pretty happy to have, especially if you have the ability to get that Infusion going consistently. Now, moving on to some combat tricks to be aware of. You'll notice here, these are the combat tricks available at common. There is not a red combat trick at common, so keep that in mind. A lot of the more tricky stuff that red is doing with combat tricks potentially at common is just casting like instant speed spells to work with Opus or something like that. White has Interjection, 1 mana +2/+2 in First Strike. Blue has Chase Inspiration, 1 mana +0/+3 in Hexproof until end of turn. Black has Masterful Flourish, 1 mana +1/+0 and Indestructible until end of turn. And then green has Efflorescence, 3 mana +2, 2+1/+1 counters onto a creature. If you gain life this turn, it also gains Trample and Indestructible until end of turn. And keep in mind that if you are playing like a black-white deck, combat tricks do get a little bit better because they will target your own creatures to work with Repartee. So if you're in the middle of combat, you save your creature with a maybe Masterful Flourish, then all of a sudden you're also triggering your Repartee cards. Next up are the uncommon combat tricks. Blue has Fractalize, so X and a blue, target creature becomes a green and blue fractal with base power and toughness equal to X+1 until end of turn. Keep in mind you can use this on your opponent's creature to turn it into like a 1/1 if you just spend a single blue mana, so that's something to keep in mind. There's also Dissection Practice in black. 1 mana, target opponent loses life and you gain a life, so it'll work with Infusion. Target creature gets +1/+1. Another creature gets -1/-1, and so you can maybe kill a small creature while also winning a combat. That could be really good, or just like use it kind of like as a glorified +2/+2. That works as well. Rabid Attack, 2 mana. Any number of target creatures each get +1/+0. When this creature dies, draw a card. So if your opponent makes a big attack, keep this card in mind because that could be an explanation. Also works pretty reasonably if you're like attacking in with pests that you know are going to die because your opponent like really wants to block them. That sort of thing can be good as well. Lumeret's Favor in green, 2 mana, target creature gets +2/+4, but if you have Infusion working, you get to copy the spell and choose new targets for it, so that can be a real good way to win a couple of combats at once. In black-white, there's Silverquill Charm, so one of the options on the charm is to put 2 +1/+1 counters onto a creature, so that can be really scary because the counters stick around, obviously. Lorehold Charm has a mode that creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain Trample until end of turn, so if your red-white opponent makes a big attack, definitely think of this card. And then Quandrix Charm, 2 mana, also has a mode, target creature has base power and toughness 5/5 until end of turn, which sometimes won't be the biggest stats. Like a 3/3 will become a 5/5. That's like +2/+2 for 2 mana, which isn't the best. But then keep in mind that there are these fractal tokens, which are like 0/0s base that have +1/+1 counters on them. And those 0/0s base will get the full benefit of the +5/+5 or of having base stats 5/5. And so they can be a really big swing in a combat or can even like hit you for a bunch of damage out of nowhere to finish off the game if it is in that sort of situation. So keep that in mind. Moving on to some trap cards to avoid. First up is Harsh Annotation. 2 mana to destroy target creature. Its controller creates a 1/1 black and white Inkling creature token with flying. You really don't want to be giving your opponents extra creatures when you are killing their creatures, especially because a lot of the time you want to be able to use your removal spells to kill like a middle-sized or small creature, and downgrading the creature instead of just straight up killing it is just not great. Turning a creature into a 1/1 flyer. The 1/1 flyer can oftentimes be a pretty scary threat, or if you're in a spot where you're trying to kill their blocker and like attack for a bunch of damage, you then just give them a chump blocker, so maybe the racing situation math doesn't add up the way you want, or the 1/1 flyer is like you're like killing a 2/2 flyer because it was going to kill you the next turn, and then the 1/1 flyer still kills you in a couple turns. It's just not really where you want to be. Next up is Arcane Omens, 5 mana for a sorcery, Converge. Target player discards X cards, where X is the number of colors of mana spent to cast this spell. In a lot of games of limited, players are only going to have like a couple cards left in their hand at that stage of the game, and 5 mana to make them discard 2 cards is just not great. In order to make them discard more cards, you'd have to like splash extra colors, which maybe you're doing, but this isn't really like a great reason to do that. Like if you're already doing that, Arcane Omens isn't like crazy. And really the only spot this really shines is if you're playing like a multicolor deck that's playing like a multicolor control against like multicolor control, where your opponent also has a lot of card draw, so you know they'll still have a bunch of cards in hand, and you can nab like 3 or 4 cards because you're playing a bunch of colors. That's just a lot of scenarios for a card that in most cases is going to be pretty bad and one you want to avoid playing. Next up is Borrowed Knowledge, 4 mana For a sorcery, you choose one. Discard your hand, then draw cards equal to the number of cards in target's opponent's hand, or discard your hand, then draw cards equal to the number of cards discarded this way. You just have way too little control over what your opponent's doing in order to make Borrowed Knowledge good. If they have like 2 cards in their hand, which a lot of the time they will in the mid stages of the game when you want to cast this, it's like you might have a card in your hand, and so you're like not really getting up any cards. It's just the sort of thing where you're just not going to get a huge advantage, and discarding your own hand puts you down a card because you have like say 4 cards in hand. You play Borrowed Knowledge, that's one of your 4 cards. Now you have 3 cards in hand. Borrowed Knowledge is on the stack. You discard your hand and draw 3. So you started the turn with 4 cards. You played Borrowed Knowledge and ended the turn with 3 cards, which is just not really where you want to be with your kind of card draw spells. There's just better options available, and this is one that you should generally leave on the sidelines. Moving on to some combos you can assemble with just commons and uncommons. First up is the combo between Charging Strife Knight and Summoned Dromedary. Charging Strife Knight is 3 mana for a 3/3 haste. You can discard a card to draw a card by tapping it. And Summoned Dromedary is a 4/3 for 4 with Vigilance, and it has 2 mana. Return this card from your graveyard to your hand. Activate only as a sorcery. That costs 1 and a white. And so if you use Charging Strife Knight to discard your Summoned Dromedary, and then pay the 2 mana to get the Summoned Dromedary back, the Charging Strife Knight, you've discarded a card and drawn a card, but the Dromedary came back, so you end up a card every time you do that, while also consistently getting your Dromedary into your graveyard and out of your graveyard to trigger those red-white cards that care about that. So that's a nice little synergy to have available without even having to cast the Summoned Dromedary, just using its ability. There's also the combo between Snooping Page, or really any Repartee card, and Scathing Shadelock. Snooping Page has Repartee. It can't be blocked this turn, and then it has, when it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card and lose a life. Scathing Shadelock is a nice top-end card for these decks because it's a 5 mana 4/6 that gets prepared at the beginning of your first main phase, and then its prepared spell is a sorcery. Target creature you control gets +2/+0 and gains Death Touch until end of turn for just a single black mana. So every turn you can cast that, it'll get reprepared, you can cast it again, and so you just trigger your Repartee every turn, make Snooping Page unblockable, hit your opponent for 4, draw extra cards every single turn. Really good combo. There's also the sweet combo between Blazing Firesinger and Rapturous Moment, just to do some really wild stuff. The Blazing Firesinger enters prepared for and has Seething Song as its prepared spell, so you spend 3 mana to get 5 mana, and then Rapturous Moment is 6 mana, 4 blue-red, draw 3 cards, then discard 2 cards, add blue-blue, red-red-red. So if you have Blazing Firesinger, you play that on turn 3. On turn 4, you cast Seething Song, then use an extra blue mana to cast Rapturous Moment, and then you've cast not only Seething Song, but also Rapturous Moment, and then you've gotten 5 extra mana spotted to you from the Rapturous Moment, and you can cast like another 5-drop. It's just a really sweet thing. Like, the end of the chain is up to you, but if you're casting these cool things together, you can trigger Opus multiple times in a turn, maybe that your opponent doesn't expect, and you can end up in a really cool situation. And then the final combo is between Zealous Lorecaster and Pull from the Grave. Zealous Lorecaster says, when this creature enters, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. Pull from the Grave is 3 mana, 2 and a black, return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, you gain 2 life. So if you have these kind of chaining together, Zealous Lorecaster can get back Pull from the Grave. If the Zealous Lorecaster dies, you can use Pull from the Grave to get back Zealous Lorecaster and one other creature. Then once you've gotten that back, you play the Zealous Lorecaster again, get back the Pull from the Grave, and every time you do that loop, you end up 1 creature, and your Zealous Lorecaster is consistently coming back. So if your opponent keeps trading resources for it, you end up in a really good spot. And you might be wondering, wait, it's a black-red combo. Black-red isn't a supported deck in this format, but you can definitely splash one half of this combo if you have the mana fixing available, if maybe you were already planning on splashing one of these colors, and if you wanted some extra late-game inevitability for whichever deck you decide to splash it in. Speaking of splashing, this is the mana fixing available in this set. First up, there are dual lands in 50% of packs, replacing the basic land slot. So those are Forum of Amity, Spectacle Summit, Titan's Grave, Fields of Strife, and Paradox Gardens. They enter tapped for one of the 2 colors associated, and then they have 4 mana, tap them, Surveil 1. So that's pretty nice upside to have on a land that's fixing your mana. And if you have one of these and your opponent doesn't, it can be a really nice late game advantage to have. Especially the red-white one can be pretty good because sometimes you might run out of cards in your graveyard to be able to exile them to certain effects to trigger your cards. And Fields of Strife being able to help you fill your graveyard while also being a dual land that helps you fix your mana is really good for that red-white deck in particular, though these are all just really nice cards to have to help your mana be more consistent while also giving you some late game advantage, and they're in 50% of packs replacing basic lands, so keep an eye out for them. There's also just in normal card slots, there's Terramorphic Expanse, which can search for your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, which is a pretty nice card to have available, especially if you're fixing. Potioner's Trove, a little bit on the weaker side. 3 mana for just an artifact that adds 1 mana of any color can be a little bit weak, but it does have some extra upside of you being able to gain 2 life and activate only if you've cast an instant or sorcery this turn, so it can help you stabilize if you are trying to play a multicolor deck that maybe falls behind early. That extra life can be valuable and also work with infusion cards. And then Studious First Year, really nice card, 1 mana, it enters prepared, it's a 1/1, then it has Rampant Growth for 2 mana, search for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So 1 mana, 1/1, then on turn 2 you can do this, or whenever you have the extra time. So getting a little bit of a roadblock or maybe something that can trade for a pest token or something like that, while also fixing your mana and ramping you. There's also a little bit of less temporary mana fixing. Goblin Glasswright can make a treasure token with its Craft with Pride mode. So the treasure token, if you're only splashing like one card, can certainly be useful for helping splash. Seize the Spoils can be a nice one. It will make you a treasure token as well when you cast it. Treasure tokens, again, can be used for like one-off splashes or just supplemental sources. And then a card like Hydro Channeling does have this mode: one, tap it, add 1 mana of any color, spend it only to cast instant or sorcery spells. If you're playing like a blue-green deck that wants a Hydro Channeler anyway, and you want to splash like a red spell, and you maybe have some other sources of fixing, this can be a supplemental source as well, potentially. Moving on to some final tips. First one, it's often beneficial to be patient with prepare cards so you can guarantee maximum value. So if you have a prepare card that has a really good spell associated with it, oftentimes it's worth waiting just that extra turn so you can play the prepared creature and cast the prepared spell all at once, so your opponent doesn't really have a window to kill the card before you can play the prepared spell. Now, obviously, there are going to be a lot of times where you just want to cast your creatures when you have the mana available to cast them, but if you have options, keep that in mind as a potential one to help you guarantee maximum value from your cards, so your opponent can like never really stop you from getting your advantage and pulling ahead in the game. And then the final tip is there aren't tons of converge payoffs, so if you see one early, you might not see more. If you open a card like Transcendent Archaic and you're like, oh, I'm going to try to build this 5-color Converge deck, that can be a really tricky thing to do because it's not really the most well-supported archetype. The most well-supported archetypes are the ones we talked about, the 5 main colleges of Strixhaven. So if you see these sorts of Converge cards and think, oh, I'm going to do this really fancy deck, that can sometimes backfire because you just might not see the payoffs for your deck. A more kind of responsible way to kind of get into these sorts of cards or take these cards is if you're already playing maybe a blue-green deck that's planning on splashing a red card, and then you see one of these Converge payoffs and you're like, okay, maybe I'll play this random black-green tap land that I already had access to. Maybe I'll use my treasure tokens a little bit more like in a different way, or something like that. And then you can maybe sometimes get the 4 colors for Converge, or sometimes maybe even if you're like planning on splashing a couple cards, maybe you can get the full 5 colors in an ideal scenario. But a lot of the times you want to start with the more responsible deck, be like, okay, I'm already playing a blue-green deck splashing red, maybe this Converge card can actually be a card that I'm looking for, versus being like, oh, I see a Converge card, this is clearly a deck, I'm going to do this, without fully understanding the set. That might be an easy trap to fall into, but there just aren't tons of Converge payoffs, so keep that in mind. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and comment if you have any questions or feedback. And to let me know you made it all the way to the end, leave hashtag Secrets of Draft in the comments section down below. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you at school.